Honored to have with us our guest speaker, Gregg, who is the director of the Middle East Forum. Gregg functions as its Chief Operations Officer for day-to-day management, communications, and financial resource development. Gregg previously served as director of the Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. In 2014, he was named one of the 10 most inspiring global Jewish leaders by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. He previously served as a political advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel and worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Everybody make sure your cell phones are well away from you. Mr. Roman is a frequent speaker at many venues around the world. He often appears on television and has written for The Hill, The Forward, the Albany Times-Union, and other publications. He attended American University in Washington, D.C., and the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel, where he studied national security and political communications. Let's give a warm welcome for Richard Roman.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Might be a little bit too loud if I use this, rather than if I don't use this. But we'll use it. Okay. So I have the opportunity just to say a few words about this shul before I get into the matter of my talk today. And that is that I've had the privilege of being an Adath Israel Early Childhood Learning Center parent for the past 10 years. We've had 4 kids go through this school here, starting in 2015. We have 3 kids who have finished all the way through kindergarten and 1 who's currently in the Happy Hippos, I think. I'm not sure what age that corresponds to. I'm pretty sure I remember who my 4th is. She's almost 3. But once you get past that, it's great. And the Jewish education that this shul provides, not just in its formative years, but also through its Makom program, through everything that the education department gives, the great Friday morning services that the Rabbanim, the rabbis of the synagogue give, really has done a lot for my family. So I want to thank everybody for allowing us, even though we're sort of passive members, I probably spend more time outside of Philadelphia than I do here, unless it's pick up and drop off, to be able to say thank you for all of that. So I'll give you a little bit about the background of my organization, why that's important for the context of today's talk, and also then really get into the heart of the matter, which is Israel's 7-front war. Some people say 9 fronts, some people say 12, but we're really going to define it to the geopolitical issues that Israel is dealing with in the region today. Let me also address what I hope not to talk about, unless you have questions about it, and I'll hope to give you an honest answer while sort of calling balls and strikes. I don't want to talk about U.S. politics today. I don't want to talk about the position of the candidates as it relates to Israel or as it relates to the Middle East. We can get into that privately if you'd like to, but I really want to focus on the content matter as it associates to Israel's war within its borders: Gaza, the West Bank, Egypt, Sinai, Yemen, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iran. Those are the things that I'd like to cover today, and we only have, according to the time, 43 minutes to really cover all those 9, 10, 11 different topics. So let's see what we can get into. First, a little bit about the Middle East Forum. Another member of this shul, Daniel Pipes, founded the Middle East Forum 30 years ago in Center City, Philadelphia in January of 1994. We've existed as an organization that provides intellectual, operational, and philanthropic efforts to try to promote American interests in the Middle East, but also to guard Western values from Middle Eastern threats. That means that if there is a war going on in Israel, we try to provide what we believe is our interpretation of why it's in America's interest to defend Israel from that war, or to assist Israel in its defense against those who have perpetrated the war. On the other hand, if there are anti-Semitic protests going on outside of City Hall, where there are anti-Semitic encampments going on led and inspired and really driven by Islamist organizations, not Muslim organizations, but Islamist organizations, those who seek to interpret the Quran in a pernicious way, which is anathema to American values, we also get involved. So we have a domestic component, but part and parcel, we have a foreign component that goes along with that as well. Now, some of our projects that exist are meant to sort of conceptualize where you take the intellectual arguments over the future of the Middle East and America's role in it, and then to really bring it to the grassroots and grasstops engagement of how we approach this. So we have a group called Campus Watch. We don't look at the students, we don't look at the college presidents, we're not looking at all the faculty, but we specifically focus on Middle East and Islamic Studies faculty at American colleges and universities, because they are the backbone of the anti-Israel, anti-American involvement in the Middle East movement on college campuses in America. Or we have Islamist Watch, which doesn't focus on mosques, doesn't focus on the Muslim way of life in the United States, but it focuses on city councils in cities like Hamtramck, Michigan, which have a Yemeni Islamist Al-Qaeda sympathetic mayor who tries to take down the LGBT flag during Pride Month, who tries to make the Adnan, which is the Islamic call to prayer, available at 5 in the morning, waking up the Polish majority citizenry of the city. Or he even goes so far as to try to divest his city's bonds and assets and investments from Israel, which is against Michigan law. So we're getting very, very specific and nuanced and really tailoring and honing in on issues which you may not be aware about, but that's our raison d'etre, to exist as an organization. And that's the kind of analysis that I hope to give to you today. We are now almost 1 year since October 7th. We have the Chagim coming up. We have the Hebraic anniversary of the attacks coming up on Simchas Torah. But we also have 11 and a half months to reflect on how this war started in the Gaza Strip in what's called Otef Aza, or the Gaza envelope, outside of Israel's borders and then coming inside. But then how did it spread? On October 8th, when Hezbollah started attacking the Israeli north, when Syrian Shia militias constituting Pakistani and Afghani and Iraqi groups inside Syrian territory, you may not have known that, launching rockets against Israel. When we had groups like Kataib Hezbollah, which is the largest Shia militia sponsored by Iran in Baghdad, who also constitutes many members of the ruling coalition of the Iraqi government, launching drone attacks and long-range missile attacks against Israel. How did we get groups like the Houthis? Who heard of the Houthis before October 7th? Some may have, because they were in the news. There's been efforts, but you're more likely to have heard of Al-Qaeda in Yemen rather than the Houthis, who actually for the past 70 years have been waging warfare both against other Middle Eastern allies of Israel like Egypt, if you remember the Egyptian-Yemeni war of the 1950s, or even against Israel's new allies and new frenemies, if you want to call it, engaging in a decade-long war against Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates up until about 1.5 years ago. We also have Iran that we have to deal with. And not just Iran in terms of the malign actors that are sitting in Tehran coordinating the symphony of destruction which is attempting to attack Israel from every single corner of the Middle East, but also the Iran that European and American diplomats are engaging with, because Iran is not a homogenous state. Iran actually in and of itself constitutes the majority of minorities in the country. So when I say Iran, I could be speaking about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or I could be speaking about Sunni Arabs, or Azeris, or Kurds, or Lurs, or Gors, or Turkmen, or others. Every single issue that we'll touch on in the next, now, 38 minutes will have to constitute nuance, because nothing in the Middle East is straightforward. That's lesson number 1 that I really want you guys to get out of the talk today. So let's start with Israel. Where are we today, and where are we going? Specifically within the country's borders. Israel, to the detriment of its economy and its security, waged an internal political war against itself with what was called then the judicial revolution, or the judicial reform efforts that took place between the election of the Netanyahu government after Bennett and Lapid and their coalition sort of went to the wayside, after members of Naftali Bennett's political party bolted the coalition about 1.5 years ago. That's almost 2 years ago now. And in doing so, Yariv Levin, Israel's justice minister, thought he could wage a political gambit which may be acceptable in a Western liberal democracy. But what he forgot is that Israel is not geographically located in the West. It's still a country which has neighbors who have the Middle East problems which started way before Akamat Medina, before the beginning of the state. Nor is it a problem which is going to go away anytime soon. So regardless of what my opinion is on Israel's judicial reform, what I'm talking about something here is larger. It's the fact that a Middle Eastern democracy which seeks to espouse Western liberal values perhaps picked the wrong time for this debate. At any given moment, Israel has had furious political struggles over the character of the country, over what it means to be Jewish or democratic, over what the economic system should be, whether it's the socialism of the Labor and Mapai parties going back to the 50s and 60s during what was called Tekufat Hatzena, or the time of now I forget the word in English. Anyway, austerity, during the times of austerity during the beginning of the state, or in the 70s and 80s when there was a real concern over alleged Ashkenazi racism towards Sephardic and North African members of the country, or in the 90s when you dealt with the Oslo process, or in 2005 when you had disengagement. There's always been tension between different political parties in Israel, between a multipolarity system, a multipolar political system, whether it's the religious and the secular, or the Sephardim Ashkenazim, or the Arabs and the Jews. There's always been tension. But why was it that the judicial reform was something that Israel's enemies woke up to and said, hold on a second, we have an opportunity to maybe end the Jewish state? The reason why is because in this time, versus every other internal struggle which Israel had faced, you had a declaration from members of Israel's security forces saying that one of the tools of political pressure they would use against the government to oppose judicial reform was to not show up for their security obligations. They would not attend reservist exercises, they would refuse to fly, they would quit their command positions. Again, this is not a critique over judicial reform in favor or against. It is a signal that members of Israel's military, specifically its reservist forces, gave, whether it be unwittingly or unknowingly, to Israel's enemies, and said, hold on, there's an opportunity here. If Israel is not combat ready, that means we may have an advantage. But that's not the only signal that came from Israel or members of its reservists and its security forces. Another signal came from 15 years of Netanyahu government policy and Bennett government policy for about a year and a half. And that was one in which Israel strategically was willing to pay off its enemies rather than to engage with them directly. That means that in 2009, after Operation Cast Lead, in 2012, after Operation Pillar of Defense, 2014, after Operation Protective Edge, 2018, Operation Guardian of the Walls, it was actually 2021. Anyway, 7 different rounds of conflict in Gaza, 2 of which involved ground incursions. One at the beginning 15 years ago split Gaza in half between Gaza City, the Mediterranean Sea, and Nahal Oz, one of the kibbutzim on Israel's border. Every single time that the conflict ended, Israel had declared it a victory. It had established or reestablished deterrence against Hamas. What did that deterrence look like? 1,000 Palestinian terrorists dead, a few dozens of Israeli soldiers and civilians killed, injured. But it also led to billions of dollars, both from the West, whether it be from agencies like the United States Agency for International Development, or the European Union's High Representative for Foreign and Security Affairs, or in the more likely scenario, billions of Qatari and other Arab country dollars coming back into the Gaza Strip, ostensibly for reconstruction. You had projects like the World Bank's water reclamation projects. You had efforts to set up a stock exchange in Gaza. You had efforts to try and modernize hospitals in Gaza. Now, if you see the headlines, every single time that you see an allegation of an Israeli strike against a hospital, what is the word before hospital? The Kuwaiti hospital, the Jordanian hospital, the Emirati, the Qatari, other hospitals. Every country wanted their little fiefdom in their ability to give aid to the Gaza Strip after the 6 or 7 different rounds of conflict. But what this did is it set up a paradigm in which Israel thought it could, quote unquote, mow the lawn rather than to take out terror root and stem. And the process over the last 15 years, between 2008 and 2023, was not just a system that didn't work for Israel, allowing something like October 7th to happen, but it's also the strategic cover, or what in the Russian KGB used to call disinformat, or kompromat, which was the system that Hamas had set up to be able to get to the point where they had the capability to launch an October 7th-like attack. Two specific indicators bring us there. One in 2021 and the other in 2022. These were the two only tit-for-tat attacks where Gazan-based terror organizations launched rockets against Israel, and Israel responded in kind, where Hamas sat the rocket attacks out. It was Islamic Jihad against Israel, not Hamas and Islamic Jihad against Israel. Why is that significant? Because Hamas was trying to fool Israel into thinking that they were more interested in economic prosperity of the Gaza Strip rather than planning a massive October 7th-like attack. So while they sat it out, it was only to go in the fourth quarter to think that they could finish the game against the Jewish state. So this is how we got to October 7th. One, you had signaling from Israel's reservists that they would put political goals ahead of the security and existential needs of the state. And two, you had a policy by the Netanyahu, and to a lesser extent, because he was only in power for a year and a half, the Bennett governments, that it was better to deal with the terrorists than it was to defeat them. So we get to October 7th. All of you know what has happened over the past 11 and a half months. So maybe we'll fast forward to where we are now, if that's okay with everyone. We can answer questions about the specifics a little bit later on. Today, we have between 97 and 101 Israeli, Jewish, and Arab hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza. Back in November, over 100 were released in a deal. And the reaction in Israel to these some 100 hostages, including the bodies of dozens who were taken back into the Gaza Strip on October 7th, or who died after the kidnappings took place, is the subject of another fierce internal Israeli debate. Do we bring them home now, or do we defeat Hamas and use military pressure as a way to bring them home later? I say later because bring them home now is akin to agreeing to a ceasefire proposed by the United States. It means ending the conflict in Gaza today, allowing Hamas to exist as it constitutes itself today, stopping the IDF's offensive operations in Gaza, and allowing a stagnated release on a 1 to 15 Israeli civilian for Palestinian terrorist released scenario. That means that if you are getting 100 Israelis back, 1,500 of the worst Palestinian terrorists in Israeli jails will be released. So, just to go back to 2011, when the Gilad Shalit deal took place, Gilad Shalit, for those of you who may recollect, was an Israeli soldier serving in a tank unit that was captured and taken into Gaza for a 5-year stint in Gaza's tunnels back in late June 2006. This is before the Israel-Lebanon war began, or the second Lebanon war between Hezbollah and Israel started. In the fall of 2011, Shalit was released in a deal for 1,000 Palestinian terrorists. Included in that deal was Yahya Sinwar, the current head of Hamas, in addition to dozens of other field commanders and individuals who planned the October 7th attacks. One of them that was released, thank you, is here. One of those that was released is also the new head of Hamas's West Bank operations, who has called for a resumption of suicide bombings in Israel proper. In the last 4 weeks, there has been one suicide bomb attempt in Jaffa. His device blew up before he was able to carry out the attack. There was 2 car bombings which took place in the West Bank. And there was a fourth attack which was stopped by Israel's security services. There has not been a significant suicide bombing in Israel since 2006, when Congressman Eric Cantor's nephew was killed in Tel Aviv. Because of this, we have to realize that when Israel's security forces and its political echelon are considering whether to sign a ceasefire today, there is sort of a Pandora's box which becomes available to Palestinian terrorists in terms of what they're able to actually effectuate in terms of terror attacks against Israel. So the Bring Them Home Now movement, who wants a ceasefire today, is saying, in other words, I'm not trying to give you what I think about this, because you'll probably get that out of the analysis that I give a little bit later on, but I'm just telling you guys what the options are. If you bring them home now, you will release 1,500 of the most dangerous Palestinians that are currently serving, in many cases, life terms in Israeli jails. However, if you do not agree to a ceasefire, and you continue until Hamas is so-called defeated, and if anyone questions if Hamas can be defeated, many people question if ISIS could be defeated. It was, in Iraq and in Syria. But if you agree with Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu and Deri and others who are currently sitting in Israel's security cabinet that you can defeat Hamas, there's a price that comes with that. And that price is the potential and high likelihood that many of those 100-some Israeli civilians and soldiers who are currently sitting in Hamas captivity will die. They will either be executed, like Hersh Goldberg Poland and 5 other Israelis were a few weeks ago, when just the day before an Israeli Bedouin man had been freed from a Hamas tunnel. Or you may get to the point where Hamas is put into a situation where it realizes that the existence of its leadership, including Sinwar, is dependent on releasing those hostages. But I think they'd rather go down with the Titanic than they would at trying to get a lifeboat into Egypt. Because of that, Israel is dealing with a very difficult situation. But at the end of the day, if I was to be asked, what do I think Bibi is going to do? He will pursue the defeat of Hamas rather than agree to a deal which does not allow him to resume offensive operations against Hamas in Gaza. But that's sort of the small fish right now, because a much larger conflict is brewing to Israel's north. I never thought I would give Bibi the nickname the Grim Beeper, but tried a little levity because we just had a very hard 3 minutes. But his operation below the belt was really the, there's another one. But his efforts now to carry out what I think is the end of a 2-year supply chain disruption operation against Hezbollah's rank and file membership in addition to its leadership was a pretty good play in what I believe is the opening to an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. The difference between Hezbollah and Hamas, or at least their threat status right now. Hamas has largely lost its ability to engage in strategic actions against Israel. A strategic action is something like an October 7th-like attack, or the ability to launch 400 rockets in one salvo, or the ability to have multiple suicide bombings taking place in Israeli city centers on a holiday. Hamas has lost its edge to be able to fight against Israel. However, Hezbollah has only been training and preparing in terms of pre-conflict rituals, which in this case would maybe being anti-tank missiles being launched against Israel's border, creating a Hezbollah security zone in Israel. Has anyone heard this analysis? Yeah, the difference between Hezbollah prior to 2000 and Hezbollah after 2023? So did anyone ever visit the north of Israel when Israel was occupying southern Lebanon between 1982 and 2000? Anybody ever have the chance to see the border there? So when you went up, you'd go to Rosh Hanikra, and you would look across the border, and you'd realize that Israeli military outposts were all along the Lebanese border, and they controlled some 20 kilometers into Lebanon proper. The reason why they had the occupation of this territory was to ostensibly create a buffer zone between Hezbollah's assets, which were deep into Lebanon, Israeli forces then with a security belt, and then Israel's border proper. Now in 2000, Ehud Barak decided to unilaterally withdraw Israeli forces south of what's called the Blue Line, which is the internationally recognized border between Lebanon and Israel. And of course, the day after he withdrew, Hezbollah came up to the Blue Line and started attacks again against Israel. And it was in 2006, July 3rd of 2006, I think July 3rd or July 2nd, that Israel was the victim of a cross-border attack by Hezbollah's Radwan force. This is the infamous Radwan that you've heard about for the past week or two, or maybe the past year if you've been paying closer attention, in which Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev, two Israeli soldiers, reservists, were killed and their bodies were brought across the Israeli-Lebanese border by Hezbollah terrorists. This is about 2 weeks after Gilad Shalit was kidnapped. And since 2006, even after the Second Lebanon War ended, Hezbollah has been on Israel's border. But what Hezbollah did not have, which it does have today, is a buffer zone in Israel proper. Whereas Israel had 15 kilometers to the Litani River into Israel, into Lebanon proper, Hezbollah has effectively created a security zone where it is able to extend Hezbollah sovereignty into Israel proper by controlling the movement of Israeli civilians and Israeli military forces, threatening any Israeli who is within 4 kilometers of the Lebanese-Israeli border. 100,000 Israelis are not able to be in their homes today because Hezbollah has said to them, we will kill you if you are in this area. Hezbollah is dictating the movement of Israeli citizens in Israeli territory. That has been the situation and the reality in Israel since October 8th. And I don't have to say this to this audience, but a quip that I might make to a non-educated, non-Jewish, non-pro-Israel audience is imagine if Mexico was able to tell residents of El Paso where they can move. We would never stand for that, let alone people in Detroit being told what to do by people in Toronto or Waterloo, whatever the town is. Anyway, so I think one of Israel's biggest strategic failures of dealing with Hezbollah was not agreeing to do something in Lebanese territory on October 8th when Hezbollah started getting involved in the conflict. Hezbollah has been able to dictate Israel's moves for the past 11.5 months, and with the destruction or the detonation of over 4,000 communication devices in Hezbollah's hands, both on Tuesday morning and then on Wednesday morning. The first round was beepers. The second round was batteries attached to Hezbollah's radios, their tactical radios. The third round was solar water heaters, which were on Hezbollah's affiliated member households in Dahiyya. Dahiyya is the Hezbollah stronghold in southern Beirut. Those were the opening shots. Think of it akin as to the 101st Airborne dropping their parachutes over Normandy on June 5th. Okay, we have not reached D-Day yet, but this was the preemptive blow. This was the shot across the bow. This is the last message both to Hassan Nasrallah, his deputy, and to Amos Hochstein, the U.S.'s envoy to Lebanon and to Israel, saying if you do not capitulate, if you do not withdraw your forces, if you do not allow Israelis to go back to the Blue Line, this will be what precipitates an invasion of Lebanon by Israel. And by the way, we're not going to stop at the Litani River. We will go all the way to Beirut. And just like we made the mistake of mowing the lawn in Gaza, we will be taking you out root and stem in Dahiyya. I think that's what his I think that's what his policy is. And I think one of the main reasons he has been trying to switch his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. There was this effort by Gidon Sar, a former member of Likud, who's now sitting in the opposition with his political party, because there's some tension in Israel's security cabinet and in its full cabinet on whether the current constellation of security or ministers with security responsibilities are willing to go head-to-head against Israel's general staff and say, these are the war goals against Hezbollah. We're going all the way. I think they should go all the way. Just be sure, I also recognize that this means that hundreds more Israelis and Israeli soldiers will die. And Israeli towers, some of which are 40 or 50 stories, will fall because of Hezbollah's precision-guided munitions. That means skyscrapers will be on the ground, and tens of thousands of civilians will be hurt, hundreds will be dead. But I think Netanyahu, I hope Netanyahu, or at least some of Israel's military leadership, realizes that if Hezbollah is able to get off from this 11 and a half months of conflict unscathed, then they will take the Hamas lesson and build back up to the point where they can carry out their own October 7th. So that's Lebanon. In terms of just the other areas that we're dealing with, and we'll get to Iran in a second, sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the Middle East room. The Houthis in Yemen have been effectively deterred for the past 2 months. They launched a drone, actually in an area of Tel Aviv that I used to live, which went all the way through, I would have a map of the Middle East here, but they went across the Gulf of Aden, up the Red Sea. They flew over the Sinai Peninsula rather than flying over Israel proper, went out onto the Mediterranean Sea and then made their way, much like a jet would be landing at Ben Gurion Airport, on the same track. And then they exploded a drone right in the middle of Tel Aviv, about 2 blocks from the former American embassy. After that took place, Netanyahu and the security cabinet decided that it was important to send a message to the Houthis that if they were to launch one attack against Israel's civilian epicenter, what I would call Medinat Tel Aviv, the state of Tel Aviv, which I think is wrong for other reasons. An attack on Eilat should be treated just like an attack on Tel Aviv, but that's not how they see things. They blew up the only port that Yemen had available to it to bring in massive supplies of oil and gas and also of weaponry in a place called Hodeidah. You've seen less Houthi attacks since then. They tried again last week with what they called a hypersonic missile, which actually landed in Modi'in. It was shot partially out of the air, but they've been somewhat deterred since. As it relates to Iran, the first Iranian response to Israel killing its head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' operations in Syria and in Lebanon in April of this year was to launch 300 drones and rockets, long-range rockets, against Israel proper. A Middle East-wide air defense alliance constituting Israel, the United States, the UK, France, but also Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and even to a certain extent, and I'll talk about this, radars being used in Turkey to identify these incoming projectiles, was able to attain a 99.2% interception rate. I just ask you the question, if that 0.8% that was launched, which landed, had a nuclear device on it, would that 99.2% interception rate matter? No. That being said, Israel's response was much, much smaller, but its impact was much, much greater. Israel was able to use a stealth missile to hit a radar array next to Iran's uranium enrichment facility in a town called Isfahan, in the center of Iran's air defense. When I say an array, think of air defense, you have north, south, east, west. They were able to get past 4 different sets of radar to take out one very specific battery in what was supposed to be the last line of air defense if there was a much larger attack by Israel against Iran's nuclear program. So, whereas Iran gave sort of a shotgun approach, we're gonna fire all these missiles, all these drones, we're gonna go all over the country, we're gonna target you everywhere, Israel. Israel's response was like a sniper. They went to the heart of the area which was supposed to protect Iran's nuclear program and said, we can get here, imagine everywhere else we can get. And then they telegraphed that point during the swearing in of Iran's new president, Parchizadeh, let's say that wrong, and assassinated the head of Hamas at an IRGC guest house, which is supposed to be the most secure place in Iran, even more than the president's house or the Ayatollah's house himself. It's the kind of people they're hosting, the head of Islamic Jihad, head of the Taliban, head of Hamas, and they got him in his bedroom. And Iran said the response would be swift and would be overwhelming. Iran hasn't responded yet. You ask yourself why. Even when Fuad Shukar, the head of Hezbollah's army in Lebanon, was taken out, Hezbollah's defense or response was 300 rockets across Israel's north. Not one made a dint or a ding in Israel's systems. Even more than that, after Israel assassinated the head of Hezbollah's Radwan unit, its elite unit, its response has now been to extend its rocket fire, which had previously put 500,000 Israelis in danger's way, to extend it to 2 million Israelis in danger's way, or in harm's way, hitting the Krayot, the suburbs of Haifa, last night. But I think that will only act as more of an impetus for Netanyahu to launch a full-scale invasion of Lebanon. With that being said, Iran is the danger that has to be dealt with. But I am not an advocate for an Israeli or American strike against Iran. Why not? 2 reasons. One, Israel would only be able to delay the Iranian nuclear program, would not be able to destroy it, unless Israel used its own nuclear weapons against Iran. And I think that that would put into question the ability for the Jewish state to exist as the Jewish state, offensively, preemptively, not as a defensive means. And I think the US, both under a Biden, a Trump, or a Harris administration, all 3, unless Iran sunk an aircraft carrier, which they might do, might try to do, who knows, there will not be enough political will in this country to support sustained offensive operations against Iran's nuclear program. I just don't think it exists on the Republican or the Democratic side. So I was told not to get into politics, but that's pox on all your houses. I don't know, maybe Jill Stein will, but sorry, I digress, I'll bring it up. But if you're a Green supporter, I'm really sorry if I insulted your candidate. But anyway, in all fairness, I don't think that Israel can destroy its nuclear program. I don't think the United States has the political will to do so, but there is another way. And this is what I call non-kinetic coercion. The idea that you can win with an insurgency supported by the West, but led by Iranians in Iran, very much like the Ayatollah did with French support in 1979. The consistent public polling of Iranian minorities, and even the Persian majority, over the past 5 years, since 2019, since the labor protests of December 2019, has consistently shown that between 85 to 90% of the Iranian population is not in favor of the Ayatollahs. They do not support the regime in Qom, in Tehran. And I'm not talking about students at Iranian universities who are usually the first onto the streets. I'm talking about bus drivers in Mashhad. I'm talking about those involved in the construction industry in the northwest town of Rasht, which is on the Azeri border. I'm talking about the Iranian Arab Sunni majority in Khuzestan province, which is where 90% of Iran's oil is refined. Imagine if those oil refinery workers went on strike. It would collapse the Iranian economy overnight. In fact, if you actually know a little bit of the history of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, when did the Shah decide to flee? When the Grand Bazaar, where most of Tehran's economy in the center of its merchants' quarter, went on strike and wouldn't sell eggs and milk and fish and whatever else to Iran's citizens. The Shah fled when the market turned against him. The same story is true some 45 years later. So if there is a concerted effort to cause low-intensity, non-violent, labor-like disturbances in Iran, it has the potential to do much more damage than the military strike might. But no one's tried it yet. So I'm going to stop there, because this is supposed to end at 11, and I'll have 8 minutes for questions, or more if you guys want me to stay longer. And I just want to thank Adath for being such a great home for my kids, for being a great pro-Israel and Israel-friendly shul, and also for giving me the opportunity to speak this morning. So thank you, everyone.